in the den of iniquity. Vicinity no pretty, calamity fi hit we any moment. What a pity. Tomorrow never certain. What dwells behind the curtain? The face of evil smirking with the shifty eyes averting. It's not a steady bubble that either pop or topple. Many will fall and stumble. Let the dozers gather rubble. From LA to Colorado, Guinea to Burkina Faso. Cannons could reach the towers and the troops will storm the castle. I say, run, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. So run, run, come, make we get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. I say, run, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. Lord, run, run, come, make we get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. With the rubble steady rising, and hearts are compromising. Convictions here are stifling, making evil appetizing. The fists are steady forming, and countenance is falling. Defenses are withdrawing, possibilities are falling. In these your circumstances, evil will make advances. Pick up your sword and lances, and be sure to take your stances. Victory is never promised, the battle is upon us. Gather the brave and honest, and the righteous in your corners.
Hello, 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 ladies and gentlemen, and we're starting the show off with a bang, starting the show off with a super chat. Shout out to Atonement in the building, starting us right, saying shout out Ike. He's got the $4.99. Thank you very much. You got a sound effect for us, Dr. Thunder there to commemorate.
Sure.
Congratulate. Yes. Much appreciated. Go ahead and click the like button, click the subscribe button if you have not already, and share the stream. We're continuing this conversation about culture and wealth. Is there such a thing as a wealth culture? Is your group wealth a function of group culture? What exactly is culture as opposed to just circumstances that are surrounding your environment? Okay, and what perhaps could be pointed to as, shall we say, detrimental aspects of the culture? In this case, we've been talking about FBA culture, African American culture, if you will, right? Using that as a case in point, and having the conversation with Glenn Lowry here and Coleman Hughes. How's it going, Dr. Thunder? How are you doing? You ready?
I'm all right, man. I'm all right. You've had a good week, I trust?
Yes. I cannot complain. You know, things are interesting as usual. You know, lots of things happening. It's the middle of summer, and besides being hot and crazy, there's a lot of exciting things. Is it? We're at the end of summer?
Right?
Oh, is it? Okay. I hope so. I hope so, indeed.
Maybe in Nigeria, it's still I'm not sure how that lines up.
Yeah, it's over there in the equator. Weather doesn't change that much.
Right.
Doesn't really change that much. That's why it's dusty Africans. Been dusty for a long time. Still dusty with a light sprinkling of ash. But we'll continue our conversation here with Professor Glenn Lowry. Okay, we're gonna jump right in, right? But let me just say that, you know, this is part 4 of a conversation, right? This is part 4. So if you're listening to this, you want to go back and check back part 1, 2, and 3, where we lay down the groundwork in part 1 regarding, well, what are some of the, shall we say, excuses that is typically given? Slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, racism, right? With regards to the wealth gap. And then we went into, well, let's talk about specifics of the culture. Dr. Thunder highlighted some aspects called swag over substance and politics over economics, over politicization, or falling prey to political animals, falling prey to becoming a political pawn, right? Rather than addressing issues economically. And that these things will keep your group down, if you will. Let's get right in the middle of a stream of consciousness here by Glenn Lowry, and let's see where he's at. But there's another super chat. Okay. This is getting, Don DeMarco himself, Nick Pin in the building. And yes, Nick Pin, I know I still got to respond to you regarding, the little, the email you sent. Yes. There will be contact happening soon. Eventually, I should say. Let's go.
some examples. Moynihan, The Black Family, 1960s. So he writes a report, Structured Black Family. So he gets a big brouhaha. Everybody knows about this. Books have been written about. Very good book by my colleague, the historian James Patterson, here at Brown on the Moynihan Report, which I commend to anybody, which tells the history of this controversy. But the bottom line is, he looks in the mid-60s at a quarter of African-American children born to unmarried women compared to like 5 or 8% of whites, 10%. He says, oh, look out, we're going to have a problem. And then everybody calls him a racist, and, you know, he's blaming the victim, and there's this whole kind of shutdown. And then for, you know, like 30, 40 years, anybody's afraid to say anything about the Black family because they don't want to be Moynihan. So what's at stake? Okay. So at stake is the narrative. Whose fault is it? We say it doesn't matter about fault. All that matters is solution. Well, no, it matters a lot about fault, because fault kind of pins down the narrative in a way. I mean, that's kind of what we're arguing about.
I just want to make a quick comment here about being Moynihan. I didn't know it was a verb, you know, that if you go ahead and say something about the Black community, you're going to get Moynihan, you're going to get called a racist, you're going to be tarred and feathered. Or Mr. Charles Murray is another kind of Moynihan type of figure who wrote some things and now is a racist and will not be allowed in certain places. Some people may say, oh, this is a sign of a bad aspect of the African-American culture. But I would rethink that and go to Dr. Thunder's point, saying it's not necessarily something as keeping other people from saying something bad about your group, right? That may not necessarily be a bad thing, right? You could be like, shut your mouth about my group, but still be handling business with regards to taking care of the issues that your group has. They're not mutually exclusive. You don't necessarily have to be, in other words, the fact that you are guarded politically about your group identity, about your group image, and you're tarring and feathering people out there who say anything about your group is not necessarily a bad thing if you yourself are not putting your head in the sand as well, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can say it, but you can't say it. I can say these things about my family or my community, but you, outside of the community, you must not say those things. Yeah, and that's I think that's it's not necessarily a sign that it's not a sign that you're not about those issues, that you're not aware of those issues, that you're not addressing those issues. It's that sometimes it is not necessarily appropriate for other folks to be trying to address things. First of all, it's not going to be effective usually. Mm-hmm. Coming from without. Secondly, it'll usually be somewhat ill-informed, mm-hmm. Because you can think that you know, but unless you really are in the inside, you don't really understand the dynamics. And now there's another side of that where I actually listen to the criticisms that I hear made by white people and Asians and other folks about Black people. I actually listen to it. But I'm not the usual person.
We're arguing about the extent to which the structures of society, which are reformable through progressive political intervention, are responsible for the disparate outcome, as opposed to the behaviors, beliefs, values, anticipations, child-rearing practices, interrelations between the sexes, structure of their families, character of the peer group influences, ideals, norms, and whatnot are responsible for the outcome. That narrative is conservative. That narrative complements a minimal state. It goes along with Charles Murray's losing ground argument about we had a war on poverty and poverty won. It goes along with the people who don't want to make taxes too high, with the people who say every tub on its own bottom, with the people who say get out of the wagon and help the rest of us push. Those narratives, the narrative of explanation, values, norms, practices, behaviors, and the institutions of these impoverished communities are themselves substantially implicated in the impoverishment of those residents. Complements minimal state, low taxes, don't try to intervene too much. It's not my problem what goes on over their politics. Mm-hmm. Whereas Ta-Nehisi Coates' argument, or others like it, you plundered, the country wouldn't be rich but for stealing from these people. They never had a chance. Their citizenship was truncated from day one. They're excluded. They're marginalized. Of course, they're killing each other. because what else would you expect them to do? They ran to the barrel when you got your hand on the lid. They're fighting at each other to get to crawl up to the top and get a breath of fresh air, kind of thing like that. Compliments. We want big government. We want the United States has only got 25% of the GDP being spent by the federal government. Germany has got 40% and Sweden has got 60%. We ought to be more like Germany and more like Sweden. Those things fit together. This is really a battle about politics. The narrative complements the political agendas of fundamentally opposed forces. And Black people, in this case, are pawns in that game.
Do you really consider this is one thing that I hear Glenn say and other political critics and pundits and, talking heads and things. I'll hear them talk about how different the Democrats and Republicans are, diametrically opposed, opposing views, all of this. Now, maybe on the surface, I would argue that they're very different philosophies on the surface. But in practice, I wonder how actually different they are.
Okay, let me engage with that. And obviously the reason why I assume the reason you're asking is because while on the, previously, let me mention what you mentioned previously, which is that people on the outside taking the lift yourself up by your bootstraps stance or stating things such as, things that can be changed within the group, pointing out criticisms, if you will, it can be shut down for reasons which could be justified, right? And that's one thing Dr. Glenn Loury is talking about now, the fact that these narratives are also tied to a political structure, right? Such that if you say one thing, if you say pull yourself up by your bootstrap, then, that's a conservative thing, so you can't say it, even if it's true, let's say. And you're a sociologist at Ohio State, therefore you can't say, conservative things. You can't say pull yourself by your bootstrap things. That's for the Chicago School of Economics. That's for Hoover Institute. And our friend there, what's his name? Forget it. We know one of the most quoted people here in Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell, indeed, right? And you're saying, look, okay, sure, there's a difference in politics, right? Hence, people are heavily wedded. But what's the difference, right? That this so-called difference, right? So now we're talking about the difference. And Dr. Thunder, you're right, and you're right. So here's the thing: the difference between human beings, especially, it doesn't have to be large at all. As a matter of fact, it doesn't even have to be real. Okay. Now, because we're just talking politics here, we're not talking about anything substantive. Most people are not thinking about things from a substantive point of view. In other words, they're not looking at the landscape and say, what's going to solve the problem? What's going to solve the problem? They're typically just thinking, what team am I in, or what feels right? Whom should I be listening to? Whom are the models? Whom should I be parroting, right? So it doesn't even matter if one model is saying blue and the other is saying red, and there's no substantive difference between blue and red. It's just about the color of the hat you guys are going to wear. People will fight and kill themselves over blue and red. There's no substantive difference between blue and red. There's no problem solving. There's no something determinative or material about how the problem is going to be solved, with regards to whether you wear a blue hat or a red hat. But I need to find a team. I need to find a model. I need to find someone to listen to. Is the typical mode of human beings, as opposed to I'm going to think from first principles. So it doesn't matter the political differences are small. As a matter of fact, the more heated differences, where I'm going, tend to be the smallest ones. It tends to be sibling rivalry, tends to be between people who look alike, those types of things. So this is just the basic about human nature and I think we mentioned it before on Sunday. On Sunday, we were talking about 50-50 relationships versus traditional marriages. And we said the issues with 50-50, one of the issues is that when there's not a very separately defined roles and silos, when people are alike, there's just a tendency for conflict. So it's actually not surprising to see a lot of smoke and fire and conflict where actually there's no real difference there. So I don't know if that addresses what you are talking about.
No, totally. Yeah, no, it totally does. and to be a little bit less uh, abstract, or a little bit less maybe philosophical, there is a practical aspect of this. If you can appear to be diametrically opposed on the surface, but really behind the scenes be working together, then that is beneficial for the entire enterprise, right? Because you can keep people very much dialed in, and if they are struggling, fighting, bickering, they're bickering and fighting over your stuff, so you still got them.
100%. Divide and rule. Or if you're the WWE, you have the heel and you have the good guy, right? And then people like that stuff. And
I completely agree. And I thought very much the same thing about the Moynihan report, and just loop in the crime wave of the 60s and 70s and 80s and the spike in single parent homes. There's been an intellectual battle about what caused that. And that the stakes are completely political, because if the right-wing narrative is correct and it was a consequence of the welfare state, that has massive implications. If the left-wing narrative is correct and it was a consequence of deindustrialization and structure and bad government policy, but insufficiently generous government policy, that also has massive implications. And hyper punitiveness in terms of criminogenic prisons and whatnot. And so I've been wrestling with that question for a long time and gone back and forth on it in many ways. And I think it's a very complex question, and neither of the narratives is quite right. And then I came across this book called Lucifer Curves by the economist Rick Nevin. Do you know this?
No, I don't. I know the name Rick Levin, but I don't know Lucifer Curves.
Yeah, so Rick Nevin wrote this book in which he's talking about essentially the rise and fall of blood lead levels in different populations.
Oh.
And it sounds like a conspiracy theory at first, but then when you look at the data, blood lead levels in children correlate with almost all of these pathologies, both the rise and the fall in America, in Europe, at places where lead came into where blood lead levels rose first. You saw crime rising first.
I see.
And if you break it down by age, you get exactly the correlations you would predict, suggesting that it's lead rather than the other causes posited by both conservative and progressive intellectuals. I think that's one that kind of cut through a lot of, a lot of other arguments that I felt are made about what happened in the 60s and 70s in this country. And it's not clear what the political implications of that argument are, other than obviously make gas unleaded, which we already did. And it kind of puts us back at square one, which is how do we create the consequences for people, the best consequences for people starting in 2019, which I think is the most relevant question now. And I think we should probably stop fighting about what caused it.
One thing that I think is interesting about this point is that it just, so if this is true, if it's the lead and not the political philosophy, the difference in philosophy, right? Or the speculation of what is actually causing, the outcomes. If that is the case, then it just shows again that our predisposition is ultimate power. That's the ultimate driving force is whatever our predisposition is, whatever our genetics are, whatever our culture, the power of culture, the power of the stuff that we buy into. And at one level, maybe the most fundamental and important level, our sort of evolutionary development. So we're really sort of limited. We think that we have all of this control of things based on the way that we think. We think we are the ones that are thinking. We think that we are in control of the way that we think and the kinds of ideas that tend to occur to us. But perhaps actually what's happening is all of these other forces are actually the things that are causing those conclusions, and those ideas to even arise in the first place.
That is true. That is true. I mean, we all know that in terms of mimicking each other, this is true. I do believe strongly on the mimetic theory of desire, that immediately you go past the basic needs, everything else that you want is because someone else wants it, all the way to the height of, in other words, that is why it is, in other words, everything is a model, hence all the way up to Jesus Christ, if that makes sense. Yeah. Right? Mm-hmm. And that you're not going to escape that. So I 100%, yeah, people think that they're over there thinking. Faust, by a famous writer, Goethe, flipped the "in the beginning of was the word" to the in the beginning was the deed, to emphasize this very point. In the beginning was the deed or the desire, and that these words do just come afterwards to kind of explain just to say whatever the hell they got to say.
Yep.
The rise in single-parent homes.
Okay, and should we also stop focusing our attention on racial gaps?
Yes, I think we should. So the pathological thing about focusing on racial gaps is that it makes us define our notion of progress in a way that would be very counterintuitive if it were any other conversation. So say you and I were driving from New York to California, you started, a day before I did, and you're 400 miles ahead of me or whatever. And now we're driving. Let's say I'm 1,000 miles from New York at this point, but still 400 miles behind you. Should I define progress by the fact that I haven't closed the gap with you at all, or the fact that I've made 1,000 miles from New York, right? Well, under one paradigm, I've made no progress at all. And under another paradigm, I've made a heck of a lot of progress. So the way we talk about gaps is very counterintuitive to me, because we're talking about groups with entirely different histories, and therefore entirely different migration patterns, entirely different values at the mean. So why would we be measuring them against one another? Moreover, there's something a little arguably racist about, at least I can see how it could be construed as racist under a very capacious definition of racism, about...
You see, yeah, what he's saying assumes that the reason we measure anything is some kind of objective reason, right? It's like, no, people are picking to measure each other because they're trying to compare, they're trying to do de-measuring contests. That's why they're measuring things.
Taking whatever the white median or mean is for some statistic, whether it's wealth, and assuming that that's like normal. Anything below that is something to be bemoaned, and anything above that is like, well, Asians, they're just somehow doing better than expected. It's like, no, white people are also a group with that can be broken into many subgroups, but that have a specific history, a specific culture. They're by no means like the default group to measure other groups against and draw conclusions from whether they fall short or ahead. I was just talking to Ian, I'm blanking on his last name, charter school.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
Yeah, and he was saying, another way of making the same point, why are we aiming for white kids, for the average white, like, rate of being proficient at reading? It's actually kind of abysmal. Like, why is that our implicit aim? It's not clear to me why that should be the case, rather than just looking at how we can be increasing scores in general across the board. How can we be increasing wealth in general across the board?
Well, let me answer why are we looking at the gaps. The implicit model is that in the default counterfactual, where there was no racial discrimination, there would be an equal outcome. And hence the gap is an indirect measure of the consequence of racial discrimination. This is, with that model, if that's your specification, if that's what you think is going on, you've got some relationship between inputs and outputs. And you got to think about the endowments and capacities of people. Of course, we're assuming those a priori to be racially equal. Otherwise, we would be, we'd be racist, we'd be white supremacists if we hadn't made any assumption about that. Other than that they were racially equal. And I'm making that assumption. Let me assume that the inherent capacities and abilities of people don't vary by race. The Asians are not intrinsically smarter than the whites are not intrinsically smarter than the blacks. And that I think the outcome is a function of people's effort. And I don't want to assume those are different either. Because what am I saying then? You blacks are lazy? That's an unacceptable stereotype of effort, ability, and we're stipulating those things to be equal at the outset, and then opportunity. So then when I see a disparate outcome by race, the reason I'm looking at the gap by race is because my default hypothetical counterfactual is I have equality, but for racial discrimination. The only issue is how much racial discrimination is there, and that's a measure of how much differences there are in these outcomes. I mean, it's Elizabeth Warren, if I'm not mistaken, is now running, it's Kamala Harris. Kamala Harris is now running, amongst other things, on the idea that corporations should be paying equal pay to men and women. for work that's similar, because she says the so-called unexplained pay gap is a measure of the discrimination. It's the same basic philosophical premise, which is the absent unfairness, there would be an equal outcome. So the gap is a measure.
You have a comment on that? Basically saying that the wealth pay gap, the wealth gap between blacks and other groups is similar to the gap between male and female, that you would have to make a lot of assumptions that there are no other factors causing this disparity other than, shall we say, the discrimination of one kind or the other. Hence, any gap is a measure, a direct reflection of this disparity, which is stipulated can be the only cause of gaps.
Yeah, so it's interesting the parallel, yes, that he draws between those two, because it's obviously the same. It's the same principle. It's the same principle. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All right. And let's see, ladies and gentlemen, go ahead and click that like button, click that share button. Okay, we're talking about wealth and culture. All right. We got Glenn Lowry and Coleman Hughes in the building. Feel free to super chat your comment. What do you think? Is the wealth of a group a function of the culture of the group? What exactly do you mean by culture? What aspects of the culture can you point out and say, hey, look, it's that's making this particular group less financially successful, if you will?
The extent of unfairness. So that's the answer to the question. Why are they looking at it? Of course, you and I reject the model. We reject the assumption that there's equality of effort. I assume we stipulate that there's equality of ability, although I could get into a long discussion with you about why we ought to stipulate that. Because isn't another implication of your way of looking at the world that we should allow for the possibility that there would be different? If you're willing a priori to simply assume that there's no differences in the intrinsic abilities of the groups, why would you object to somebody who assumes that there's no difference in the intrinsic cultures of the groups?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, obviously the model taken to its logical conclusion implies that we should be talking about why Asians have higher incomes than whites.
Yeah.
We should be wondering whether whites are discriminated against relative to Asians or Jews, or the highest.
Yeah, how about that one? Shouldn't we be concerned about whites? How come whites are not part of the intersectional gang when it comes to this wealth gap here and such? And what is interesting is, what it is interesting though that sometimes, especially let's say amongst the white group, it is okay to actually look at Asians and talk about their culture as being, shall we say, and a lot of times too, they're kind of sniping at it a little bit with the tiger mom stuff, right? But they are willing to say, hey, here's the outcome, which is better, and we're going to tie it to certain cultural norms and expectations. But when you're talking about someone whom is behind, you don't say it is because of their culture, right? Because that's uncouth. That makes you racist all of a sudden. But you can point out to Asian culture, all to the point of even discriminating against them at Harvard, for example. But let us continue.
So, taken to its logical conclusion, that's what the model suggests. Again, I don't buy that model. I think there's so much evidence from multi-ethnic societies across the world where that model leads to absurdities, where you're positing advantages for groups that are suffering pogroms. Like the Igbo in Nigeria or the Chinese in Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
So, I mean,
Go ahead. We're getting near the end of our time. I just want to add one more thought, and this is kind of a thought of my own. It's stimulated to some degree by your work, but it's a thought of my own, and that's about another reason why this colorblind, you call it colorblind, everyone will get upset if you use those words, why there's not focusing on the gaps between the races, but thinking about the structures that face individuals, and then thinking about what makes sense in terms of our reforms or whatever we want to do in terms of those structures, and where do these differences come from, and being candid and having a micro focus on those differences. And I think another reason to get out of the racial gap business is political in the broadest sense of that term. It is making the discussion a discussion about human beings and not about groups. This is an anti-identity politics speech. People will get mad. You're not supposed to say it. But that basically the frustrations that the limitations, the impediments, the unfairnesses and injustices.
Where do you stand at the end of the day, Dr. Kalanda, with regards to should we be focusing on group conversations or individual conversations? Where do you stand pragmatically, philosophically, and otherwise?
Yeah, this is a little bit tough because I think it is only natural to have some sort of concern about your community about your family, where you came from, other people that look like you, other people that came from scenarios similar to the scenarios that you came from, other people that, have dealt with similar struggles, you know. I think that is normal and natural to do, to have concern about that, and to at least somewhat engage in conversation that the end goal is to try to solve some of the mutual challenges that you have. Okay. However, nothing gets done in the sort of collective sense unless individuals are pulling their own weight. What is the thing Ayn Rand, the smallest minority is the individual, so I tend to try to focus on the things that can help the individual, and the individual's responsibility for doing things to improve their own situation, and then by virtue of the fact that they have improved their own situation, anyone that will be around them would be made better, right? So that tends to be my default on that. I mean, I'm a music professor at a major university, director of jazz studies, and a lot of what I do is recruiting. I do a lot of recruiting, and I have a vested interest in, black men and boys. And I look at the way that the numbers are not in our favor as far as population of students, the student body. Now, generally speaking, the number of black male students is on the decline. Now, I could, you can argue the system is biased against blacks, and I think it is, and that'll get you so far. Or on a one-to-one basis, I can develop relationships one at a time with prospective students, and then they will more likely want to attend the school that I'm at, right? Also, because I'm at the school and they know me, they'd be more likely to come there. So it's not just because of my recruitment of them, it's also because I look like them. Maybe the most organic way to change a particular dynamic is to, we'll say, to change that dynamic as far as demographics, is to model what you want the student body to look like in the faculty. Say, because people are tribal, and if you want to see a certain kind of quote unquote diversity, then model it in the faculty. Then you won't have to do so much sort of monkeying around with the machine, and be willing to be specific about what it is what your stated objective is. Be specific. Don't just say, well, we want to be diverse. Well, in what way would you like to be more diverse? My argument always is, well, the most underrepresented group would be black men and boys. So let's start there, see if we can get some improvement there. And again, I'm saying all of this stuff because I've identified specific things, specific challenges, specific goals, specific demographics, that I'm interested in, because the specifics, you can do something about specifics. You can't do much about abstract general stuff. You don't even know which way to walk in. You have no idea. So I think we're stuck with the individual. I think you have to, it's got to be the individual, because that's at least something specific that you can identify.
Word them up.
Because the disappointments, the lost opportunities that confront us are not racial. They are part of the human condition. There really is no justification for attacking Black poverty independently of attacking poverty. This is the argument that I'm going to try to fashion here. There's no justification for thinking about homelessness in racial terms. There is no justification for thinking about the extent of over-incarceration in the country, notwithstanding the huge racial disparity in its incidence. Primarily in racial terms, it's about how we as a country deal with our fellow citizens who have broken our laws and what's required of us and what's required of them. There's no justification for thinking about political representation. That is, the extent to which citizens have their membership in our political community effectively expressed in the deliberations of our government, primarily in racial terms. I know that's a radical thing to say, but I believe it to be true. The American Republic, structured and constructed in that way, by seeing people as members of these groups, betrays the potentiality of the founding. That's, the founders were slave owners. I know that the founders were slave owners, but the founding was not a slave expression, and its instantiation in the 21st century and the hope that it has for the world is most effectively thought of in human and not racial terms. Clarence Thomas is right about that. Again, you all can get mad at me if you want to. This man who sits on the Supreme Court and has done so for a quarter century, who's 1/9 of 1/3 of the American state, who comes up out of the Sea Islands off of the coast of Georgia and is as Black and African American as anybody will ever be, who addresses himself to fundamental questions of constitutional interpretation through the experience of his Black life, is right to interpret the founding of the US government in the late 18th century and the refounding of it in the middle of the 19th century, primarily in individual terms. That's the best path forward for this country.
All right, Dr. Thunder and Glenn Lowry, we hear you. Shout out to Technological Chaos in the building. You got a sound effect for us, Dr. Thunder?
Yes.
He says with his $10 super chat, which is much appreciated. Also, regarding the diversity and skill question, would it be valid to state that scaling up the school system antagonizes diversity and change? Large systems at any level are terrible at change. The scaling up, now any kind of change, but I wonder what you mean by the type scaling up type of change. And you
well, it seems like there's two different things that he may be addressing. So the skill question, scaling up the school,
gotcha. Yeah,
and then the second issue is the issue of the sort of larger systems, and them being sort of resistant to change because they've gotten so bulky. Seems like there's two separate things he's saying there.
Yeah, let me pick at it and see what you got to say about it, Dr. Thunder. With regards to the everything exists to kind of persist in a certain way. There is a certain amount of momentum to something existing. Another way to say it is everything is alive and it wants to survive, especially organizations created by things that are alive, such as human beings. They mimic life very much, like government organization or whatever wants to grow. It wants to sustain itself. It wants to keep its function. That's why bureaucracies typically will not kill themselves. So it's not a question of, they don't have to be malicious, okay? They don't have to be particularly obtuse or lazy or whatever in order to just have the impulse to keep themselves going and to not want to change, right? It's just a natural type of order. Things want to keep a certain amount of homeostasis and growth. Like the only change that they typically like is just get bigger, get larger, because they understand that is necessary in order to survive. it is a shame that on the kind of a skilling up thing that we are actually going the other way with regards to now wanting to remove the higher level courses. I believe you guys call it AP or whatever, like, like the higher, because it'll make
reducing what you're saying is lowering the standards.
Yeah, we're basically lowering the standards so that people whom can hack it don't feel bad. And it is pretty interesting. So are we going to do that for shall we say, for sports as well? We're going to ignore all the talented kids and just keep them, playing the same silly basketball with the rest of the other ones, and on and on and on.
Well, at least with football, basketball, and baseball, I think the answer to that question is no. The reason is because of the financial incentive, right?
Yeah.
So they won't do it for that reason. But it is not as clear what the how you would not benefit. It's not as clear what the penalty would be from a financial perspective by lowering the standards on these other kind of course you're talking about the AP classes and whatnot, because they're probably, if you think about it, okay, by lowering the standard, you're making it so that more people can do stuff at a mediocre level or whatever you want to say. But there's only a very small percentage of folks that are going to be the ones that have the kind of intelligence to be able to make actual leaps forward, advances, and they'll probably not be held back by that reduction in standard at all anyway.
You mean regardless of what the system does, they're just gonna filter through and then end up expressing the fullness of their potential at some point along the line?
Right. I mean, so once you get to college, I think that, even if college is reducing its standards, you still have a lot of really smart.
So this messes with the middle people, like the people whom are just good enough. If I'll throw IQ in there because it's a trolley term. Just like it's over 100 IQ, 110, 115. They can do. They could help with some stretching, if you will, right? And stretch themselves to get into the AP classes, blah blah blah. And they're the ones that end up losing because you're saying that the highly gifted person is going to end up shining at some point when there's less restrictions, such as, for example, in college, right?
Yeah. The highly intelligent person is going to meet every bar that you set for them anyway. Right. So if you lower the bar, they'll make that bar. If it was super high, they would make that one too. And they'll get recruited to MIT or something, and then it's not going to matter. It's not going to matter what the limitation was when they were in.
Besides the moral argument, what do you think about the people who say, who make the, shall we say, economic, the argument of, finding these diamonds in the rough? You're saying, okay, the diamonds in the rough will make it anyways. Others will say, look, out of this, the middling folk, they're not quite diamonds, but you might find a few things in there that you might give some people some training or some exposure to some aspects of things where maybe they might be part of the entrepreneurial class that may, or whatever, that there is potential even below the diamond class potential, that if you lower standards, you're really hurting yourself as a group overall. Now, because it could just simply be, rather than talk about potential, talk about like this efficient, hardworking, to make them their sharpest. There's something called 996 in China, which is, you work from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week, right? And that's what, and I remind myself of that, sometimes I listen to Dan Pena, as you know, but sometimes I just tell myself 996, like, okay, China is doing 996 right now, so stop complaining. about whatever the hell it is. Brew some extra coffee, 996 MFR.
Yeah, that's right.
So, I mean, even if it's just 996, I'm talking about, like, I'm saying, hey, the standards, not dropping the standards, are good insofar as they encourage hard work and blah, blah, blah. Even if I'm not getting the diamonds out of them, I just want a bunch of people who are hardcore and can do some 996s and understand the value of hard work and stretching themselves, something like that. Well, what would you say to that kind of an argument?
That is where I think the biggest loss would be, right? And in general, this whole everybody gets a trophy sort of, way of doing things. That's where I think we've lost the most, is we have a bunch of weak-minded folks now. Maybe they're not necessarily that much dumber, although I would argue that in general, I think Americans are dumber than they used to be. But they are lazier, way lazier, not willing to put the extra effort forth.
Mm-hmm.
Think that they are entitled, to something because they were born, all of that kind of stuff. And if you look at some of these tests, like a 8th grade level, like world history kind of test, or basic kind of information from, let's say, 50 years ago, if you gave that same test to an 8th grader today, most 8th graders would totally bomb that test.
Yeah.
Okay, they would know nothing. I mean, we're talking 20%. It's really gotten progressively worse. Now, I'm not the education as a right person, right? I'm the education as a privilege, right? So when you approach it as a privilege, then you're not taking it for granted, and you don't expect the teachers, which, in that manner of thinking, are your employees, and you ought to be getting what you want to get out of them. You wouldn't be thinking of it in that perspective. You'd be thinking it like, man, I'm very fortunate to have this opportunity, and I'm not going to squander it. Right? So that's why I'm not an education is a right person, because I see what that has done to us.
Yeah, it is. I think, the education is a right.
Nothing but college is nothing but an extension of high school at this point.
Extension of high school. High school is a babysitting service, and it's all just one extension of procrastination of adulthood, right? Procrastination of responsibility, if you will. But the right to education thing, besides being part of all that kind of rights stuff, which doesn't end, there's something egalitarian, right, about the idea of the printing press and the democratization of knowledge. And now the masses can read the Bible, and they too can blah, 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 blah. And one could even grant all that, but then mention that you are going to also then reap the repercussions of this type of egalitarianism, right? Or because when you give everybody the power of the pen, there's some people whom should not whose voices should not matter as much because they don't have anything important to say. Now, this is not about their right to speak. This is about the weight that we should give their speech, right? And when they're quote unquote educated and they can put it down in a paper or in a TikTok video in some kind of semi-articulate fashion, then everyone is obligated in this kind of a democracy way to say something about it. Yes, so I agree with you on the education not being the right thing there. Let us continue. Okay, let us continue.
Oh no, it's very controversial, but it's right. And therefore, if you take that philosophical premise, it is very natural to think about remedies for social inequality in individual and not in racial terms. To think about the loss to the country from unrealized human potential in individual and not racial terms. There are white people in the hill country of Eastern Kentucky. There are white people in the slums on the south side of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, or whatever it might be. There are white people who are unemployed in the small, dusty towns of the failing mining districts and so forth and so on. It's the wrong way to think about America. The fact that it has captured the imagination of woke progressives is much to their discredit.
I agree. And I would add that from my perspective, what you're asking for and what I'm asking for is actually not nearly as radical as it seems, because we're already not thinking in terms of racial gaps on almost every gap that exists. Nobody is losing sleep over the fact that the NBA is 3/4 Black. Nobody is losing sleep over the fact that if you compare white Americans of French descent to white Americans of Russian descent, there's a 21% income gap. Nobody is losing sleep over innumerable racial and ethnic disparities. And all I'm asking for is you to cease losing sleep over one.
We don't mind talking about German culture, for example. Like when we're comparing the different groups amongst, let's say, white people, right? We don't mind talking about how, those Germans versus the Italians, right? The Italians are Italians are going to be more stylish, okay? They're going to make crazy cars, but they're not very efficient or make a lot of engineering sense, right? Or something like that. We don't mind highlighting those differences in culture, right, Dr. Thunder?
No, the whole precision thing with the German engineering and
we take it down to the individual. We even create caricatures of, in terms of timekeeping and strictness and all that type of stuff. We see it, we say, yes, that is why they make those types of things over there. Okay. But then when it comes to certain groups, everything becomes, we have to look it through a modern intersectional lens where everything is about group power, any other interpretation brought to bear on the subject, such as arcane concepts like culture, even though, it's like 15 minutes ago in this same cocktail party, you were probably talking to this lady about German culture, right? And then 15 minutes later, you can't say culture, when we start talking about African Americans. But anyways, let's see.
One more. So it's actually not nearly as radical as it seems.
Okay, Coleman, it's an hour of interesting conversation with you. Coleman Cruz Hughes, philosophy major at Columbia University and a writer at Quillette.com. I really appreciate you giving us some time at the Glenn Show. Watch the comments. There will be pushback, I assure you.
I'm well acquainted with my critics at this point. So, yeah.
All right, thanks a lot, Coleman. We'll sign off for now.
Sure.
So, Dr. Thunder, one of the things
making myself smaller to fit in this relationship. I'm happy.
It's
not this chick, man.
not her.
God showed me why so many good women. Oh, see now. No.
No, you don't want to do a quick preview. God showed her, Dr. Thunder. I mean, don't you have to listen to the testimony of the people from? What do you think about testimony? Those people who get the spirit and start yelling at the church in the middle of a service.
Well, how can I say this?
So am I putting your employment in jeopardy here?
Yeah, right. In my mind, I'm an intellectual, cerebral kind of fellow, and that is the way that I experience the world. I don't tend to experience the world through my emotions, through sort of outbursts, a lot of tongue talking, passing out and stuff, shouting. That's not the way that I experience the world. And even when I am experiencing intense emotion, or just being overcome by, like you go to the movies and a plot twist happens and it's like, oh my goodness, or you're listening to music and just something just happens, or you're in the moment when I'm playing in church, and you can just tell something is different. You know, my response is not to lose control, than to just start doing all kinds of spastic stuff. And I think the reason, and the thing is that I'm not criticizing those that, you know, that are oriented differently. I'm not criticizing them, but it does take some people that are able to keep their wits about them when they're in the midst of something profound. Because you need people to be able to take notes. You need people to be able to be paying attention and to have enough, you know, to be noticing things. You need people to be able to do that, right? And so that's more of the way that I I am spontaneous, and you know, I'm a feeler, and you know, and all of that. But I'm also very much pensive, and you know, I'm deliberate, and all of those things are, you know, like I said, you know, other people are oriented differently. They can be the people that lose control and running around and stuff like that. That's fine. I'm not criticizing folks. Now, what I don't like is that though I don't have a criticism of folks that are not passing out, or I'm sorry, that are passing out and getting emotional and all like this. What I find is often is the case that the folks that get emotional and stuff think there's something wrong with you because you don't get emotional. You know, and that's the sort of double standard there. You know, I'm not judging you, but for some reason you think that it's your place to judge me because I'm not equally out of control. You know, and maybe even me describing it as being out of control, they would say, "See, that's what's wrong. See, you need to let go.
You need to let go. You see, there you go. They got you. They're gonna get you in therapy, Dr. Thunder. Black man.
The way I let go is by clearly understanding my surroundings and being very much aware of what's going on. That's how I let go. You can let go by walking off the side of that mountain and testing to see if gravity is true or not. I'm going to stand here and watch you fall to the ground, and then I'll know that, hey, I guess gravity really is real. I'm not going to be the person testing that.
All right. Speaking of the real, and speaking of skin in the game, we're going to take our way back to the solutions here. But skin in the game is part of the reason why you want to be at the level of the individual, because the individual has skin in the game, right? Unfortunately, there's no real collective brain, right, that has a skin in the game and that has a lot of agency. We have political groups and we have organizations and whatnot, but there's real skin in the game in the level of the individual. Economically, right, when it comes to the market and when it comes to the purity of the signals in the market, which would be price, you would want the entities that, for example, if we're going to talk about the allocation of capital, $10,000, that's it, Dr. Thunder, it's best if it's your $10,000 that you are allocating, as opposed to you just allocating $10,000. There is all the difference in the world in that right? In that distinction. Okay. Mm-hmm. That hence we want the person who has skin in the game to make the decisions for the economic engine to actually work, for the outcomes that we see to actually make sense, for the prices that we see to actually reflect the values, right? So that a little talk there about the skin in the game type deal. But if we go to solutions, if I were to say that so far you highlighted, shall we say, a focus on individual as opposed to group, which is in the umbrella of not being overly political when it comes to solutions, let's say, right? And going economic. And when you go economic, you're going to need to get skin in the game, right? So it's either going to be a level of individual or group of individual, whatever it is, right? But when you're trying to get economic outcomes as a divorced, shall we say, from political ones, you're going to change your behavior in a particular way. So if there's a focus on the individuals, a focus on the family, a focus of substance over swag, let's say, would help so far in these 4 parts of the conversation. How would you say what is the solution? Is it for these 4 things I just mentioned? How would you implement, or how would you introduce or change people from rather than fainting and getting all emotionally erratic to perhaps look around? Yeah, I like how I brought it back to the church. I knew there was a reason for bringing that.
Just for clarity, I want to make sure that I know the 4 things we're talking about.
Gotcha. So we're talking about, and I just kind of listed them because as we were going through here, there's a focus on the individual, right? Focus on the individual.
Right.
And it's the same thing about the focus, not being overly focused on politics, which is a group thing. And then you start instituting quotas and saying these people can't say this, and the whole mechanism of multiculturalism, if you will, right?
Oh, yeah.
But also there's the family thing, which was mentioned as a part of a conversation in part 2, where we were saying that, look, the Italians may do some shady stuff, but it's not that you do shady stuff, it's whether or not you have intact families, right? That you can do shady stuff while having intact families. And it is best to have intact families in the rise out of the lower classes, if you will. Because it was mentioned that it is very common for groups come in, they migrate somewhere or whatever, they're low, and then in a couple of generations they rise. But a prerequisite seems to be that you have to have a family structure. So there's the individual stuff, focusing on that. There's the family stuff, and then there's the substance over swag, right? Which then related to this whole not fainting, right, thing. Mm-hmm. So in that arena, is this the solution space? How would you go about implementing these solutions?
Yeah, that's always the challenge with the substance over swag thing. I just did I've been doing more of my impromptu streams, these car thunder, as BGS calls them, and this last one that I did this morning, it was if you think you're lonely now, wait until this flight, girl. And it was a response to something that I heard Black Ram 313 sing on one of his streams a couple of days ago. And he said that he got that from Danica Marie. And then, of course, it's a Passport Bros, sort of, parody lyric. And in that stream, one thing that I was saying was we have a tendency to celebrate. I talked about the 3 kinds of people, or the usual sort of characteristics. You have fools, simpletons, and wise, right? And what makes a fool is that they'll never learn. What makes a person a simpleton is that they require their own personal experience to learn, which is very inefficient. And what makes a person wise is their ability to learn from other people's mistakes, right? And we like the stories where we celebrate the stories where people are just total simpletons, right? Where they make all kinds of huge mistakes, and then in some way they reform, and then they say these totally bogus things like, I wouldn't change anything, because if it wasn't for that, then I wouldn't be here, and all like that, which is the dumbest stuff ever to our culture is full of dysfunction, so we tolerate, and as a default, we accept foolishness as the default, and then those folks that actually are wise are deemed as, the educated lames, or it's boring, it's not exciting, so maybe it doesn't make for a great movie, right? But I think we could do a better job of celebrating those that that they're boring but they're very good.
We spoke about models earlier,
Yeah.
I believe.
Yeah.
Unless I'm tripping. So we spoke about models, earlier, and so it is just a truism of human nature. If you don't have that, people mimic models. It just is what it is, right? You copy Brad Pitt or someone in the magazine or someone in. And by the way, there's something interesting which I've always noticed, but I didn't know it was kind of formally studied, which is when you're copying something that's fictitious or away from you in time, or just completely out of your reach socially. When something is out of reach, it has a more powerful effect on you as a model, right? As you can imagine. Okay. And the reason I noticed it was that for some reason in the past always seemed to have a heavier weight. Like, oh, this guy said it 1,000 years ago, and therefore, oh my God, it must be very important, and this guy must be very important. After all, he said it 1,000 years ago. So having the absence of such models, right, is going to reflect in the behavior of the people. The people need to be able to. So how do you create? Are you just going to pick up some lames? I think there was a site that we're going to create called Pick a Lame. That's for post wall. Okay, gotcha. Pick a lame, but so you're just going to pick a lame and prop him up as an example to the community? Is that what you're trying to do here? How do these things emerge organically, right? And I'm kind of thinking out loud through here, right? Trying to see, because
it's tough because I think that it would have to be an individual. I mean, you'd have to isolate certain individuals, and people that have money would have to say this particular individual is worth people paying attention to. They'd have to find different ways to make people aware of whoever that individual is. There's a lot of talk about father absence in the Black community and everything.
Hold on one second there. You mentioned money, and I assume you're mentioning money because they will have the power to make such pronouncements and kind of push whatever. But also, if you put an economic incentive, let's say, for example, you go out there, this deliberately to try to find a Black founder of some technology company, right, for you to fund, right? Right. So that person will become a natural model. You're like, okay, there's got to be this kid out there. I know I'm not going to just get the first one or whatever. Maybe I need like about 5, but I try to find a founder of a particular, or it's a complete total scheme, right? Someone else has the idea. You put something, but you go, whatever games you want to play. But anyways, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that you have to make the person into somebody of significance by funding their work. I think you can just have your eyes open and acknowledge the excellence that's happening around us all of the time, though it not be slinging rock, doing time in jail, getting out, reforming yourself, changing your swag, to do whatever, rather than that stuff. Just have it be something like, dude's been married to the same woman for 50 plus years. All of his kids are successful. Bought all of his vehicles with cash. Doesn't owe any money. Owns his house. Been retired for 20 years. You understand this? There are, and all of that stuff like I said, that seems like boring stuff. But that stuff is the real stuff to be aiming for, right? Because all of this sort of flashy stuff, it seems good, but it's also not likely. It's not likely stuff, right? I was watching a clip. I'm not sure who the gentleman is. I'm probably going to end up reviewing it on my show in TikTok Theater tomorrow night on Thunder's Thoughts. And but he was talking about how there's 1 million, and this was this video is from a long time ago, so maybe 30 years ago or something, 20 years ago. He says that there's 1 million black kids that want to be in the NBA. 1 million, right? And then he says, and there are but there's only, what did he say? Whatever the numbers were, 20,000 that will actually play in high school or something. 40,000, whatever it is, whatever the number is, 200,000 that will actually play in high school. Then there are only, such and such a number that are going to play in college. And then and then there's 35 will get, into the NBA. Only 7 of them will be starters. And their average, number of years that they'll play in the league is 4 years. So we are setting up these dreams, these impossible dreams for 1 million kids are aiming at a full-time job for 7 people that will only last for 4 years, right? Where there are hundreds and thousands of technology-based jobs, right? But you don't have black kids, pining after those jobs or seeing those as being, great opportunities, right? We have deified this pie in the sky thing, and it's like that or bust, all or nothing, get rich or die trying. It's that kind of approach, rather than actually isolating stuff that your quality of life would actually end up probably being better anyway, right? So that kind of thing, putting the right imagery, the right, role models, I like what Charles Barkley said, saying that he's not a role model, and that's good for now. What the detractor to what I'm about to say would say, he is, because a bunch of kids see him and stuff like this. I said, no, you got this wrong. This is a rich guy that gets paid to play basketball. What about that is the kind of thing that you want your kid to basically idolize and form the way that they view the reality of the world and of existence around.
Let me
it's
highlight
like a
something.
small percentage chance that they're going to have any kind of life like Charles Barkley.
Yeah,
so it doesn't make any sense.
I think when there's a healthy balance of role models, there's no issue with Charles Barkley, because de facto Charles Barkley is a role model, even beyond the whole kids look at him that way. It's because people have models of all kinds, including maybe some dark, shadowy figures, or people on opposing. You get the idea, right? Okay. Right. So we have the models
and by the way, and by the way, when he said he's not a role model, I don't think he really meant that he's not a role model.
Yes.
For all of the people that are putting him on this certain perspective, he's not the best, person to be trying to be like for most
so
people.
In a healthy ecosystem of role models, okay, the point is you have to have, these, shining guys on the hill type, whatever, what the middle class can strive for, what the bourgeois can reach for, that represents wholesome, blah, blah, blah. And then maybe you have some rascals, some this, that, and the others. They're different. That's a healthy system of and by rascals, you may throw in the entertainers or the basketballers or whatever, or people for whom you just admire for whatever reasons. The problem with this particular ecosystem is you don't have enough of the right type of bland middle class values type role models, right? Hence, people want to imbue all these other guys or saddle them with the responsibility of being these other models. It's like, dude, I'm not supposed to be that guy. Like, I can't, this is not my role. But I think that, I don't know what you think about that in the sense that we model other people for different reasons. And not everybody's supposed to be a Mother Teresa. As I say, I listen to Dan Pena sometimes, right? Because I need that.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree with that. I just think that we have basically no role models of the more practical.
Yeah, it's and Professor Amy Wax talks about this, these boring middle class values, which are seen as quaint, anachronistic, and almost it starts becoming racist and sexist, homophobic all of a sudden, real quick. Like it just slides down in terms of how it is viewed in regular culture. And again, it is the lame, right? Lame also encapsulates that, right? So all that lame stuff, which is otherwise necessary. Take, for example, Thomas Sowell's admonishment that, just get a high school degree, stay out of jail, and, stick with, this, don't have a child outside of wedlock. Like a few rules, about 4 of them, which just drastically increases your chance of, being in a particular class, right? But those simple things are definitely not keeping it real. Hence why this is a cultural problem, right? It's not keeping it real to be doing all that lame stuff. For some reason, something comes to mind about Africans stealing African American jobs. But in the beginning of this, someone mentioned Tariq Nasheed, but that's not why I'm thinking about this. I'm thinking about this because of some may say, because in the whole keeping it real thing, this is a subtlety, okay? The thing about the African stealing the African American's job is that the African doesn't have the burden of being it's not afraid of being a coon. You get what I'm saying? Like, so yeah. This is something that just came to mind recently while I'm listening to the people's beef. What exactly is the beef is going on here? And I noticed, you know what? The African is kind of guilty in the eyes, at least in this one way, of the African American, in the sense that he's just free cooning out there in this particular, in this Carlton class of people, in this bland middle class, blah blah blah, those jobs. He's just out there, doing that stuff. He doesn't have the burden. He doesn't have like any cultural baggage that will tell him, oh, this is not keeping it real and all that kind of stuff. And perhaps the African American doesn't really understand that, and hence he looks at the African and say, "Oh, you just love the white man." That type. I don't know. Am I making sense?
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. That's free to coon.
Yeah, it's free to coon thing.
Liberating. It's so liberating. Oh goodness! Just free to go full. Yeah, just. Oh, that's great. But it's interesting, and I think it's a pretty universal principle. Those that just don't have a certain kind of baggage, they just don't have, and they don't require the certain allegiance. And actually, I would argue that in many respects, it's what makes the so-called educated lame have an advantage over, the swagged out, all about the community, person, because they have so much stuff that they have to cater to, whereas the lame doesn't care about the social stuff, doesn't care about you know, what clothing they wear. They don't care about any of that crap. What clubs they got to be in, and you know, what's the right thing to say to this person. They don't care about that. They're just going and getting their education and doing what they need to do to get out of there. And I think that's one of the reasons why there is this sort of CGA approach to this whole thing, is, you know, to let it burn and not to try to rescue anyone. You get out. That's your responsibility. You get out. You make something of yourself, and you just gotta you just have to let go of all of the stuff that's a burden. You know, stop. You know, just drop the bag. Just, you know, just drop that baggage. Just drop it and just walk. You know. But
Okay,
that's tough.
so
it's tough, man. It's tough. I totally understand why people, and I struggle with that, because I recognize how bad stuff has gotten. In the Black community, how bad things have gotten, but and I do think that it's beyond saving, but I still I still want to try to save it. I still I still wrestle with that. It's tough, you know.
Indeed. So our solution talk here has kind of surrounded this swag over substance, middle class values, even, you know, now calling it the freedom to coon, you know, embracing coon culture. Coon culture is the question was the quest here was the wealth culture, right? That was our inquisition. I think we found it. It's coon culture is the wealthy. It's right. It's been right in front of your nose this whole time. Don't be afraid to coon. And
that's hilarious.
Yeah, because the thing. So also, and this is maybe a side point, not so important, because, you know, we're landing the plane now still on the immigrant thing, in terms of other ways in which the immigrant is guilty of you know, loving the white man too much. You see, we don't see the system as necessarily a white. Even if we see the system as a white thing, we have no issue. This is another way of saying that, you know, again, that, you know, immigrants coon hard. But the point is, what we are after is, you know, juicing the system somehow, money, whatever. We're trying to play the game, right? So we fully embrace the game, right? And that is seen as a full embrace of, you know, the white man's world, if you would, right? And I can see that. I don't necessarily think it is justified. Or what I mean, I think that it is wrong not to fully embrace the system. But then again, I see why, you know, you don't want to fully embrace the system when you have things such as, you know, the Tuskegee experiments, for example, right? Which was a thing that actually did happen, right? So it's a complex little dance there. So we're seeing the roots of some of the culture, the hindrances to full coonage, to full cooning, if you will, in these vestiges, basically lack of trust in the system and whatnot. But yeah, so you were talking about tomorrow, right? Thunder's thoughts. Okay, what exactly is going on?
So let's see here. What do I got? Let me turn this back on. Yeah, so this is my show for tomorrow. If you can get rid of the thing there. Yeah. So, is isolation contributing to the rise in mental illness? And with Vanessa Campagna, she's a great singer-songwriter. She lives in Nashville. And I met her because she was a guest artist with the band that I play in frequently, and I interviewed her on Conversations with Dr. Thunder, and I told her, after the interview was over, I said, hey, maybe sometime I, get you on Thunder's Thoughts. I said, that's my spicy show though. And she said, well, I can get spicy. I was like, okay, we'll try it. And, but anyhow, she has a new release. It's going to be a world premiere. We're going to sneak peek a little bit of it. It actually releases on the 26th. So we're going to do, I don't know, I'll probably play a minute of it or something like that. It's a new music video of hers, and it's somewhat on the topic, this whole isolation and this sort of mental health, anxiety, depression, this sort of gamut of things. And I've got a couple videos we're going to take a look at where they go into depth about how isolation and loneliness has a particular impact on developing mental illness, and that we'll take a look at, especially the last couple years and this sort of acceleration of new mental illness, basically record numbers, suicides, and all kinds of things. So that'll be the general topic. But, we'll always, as with Thunder's Thoughts, we'll always have some TikTok theater, or we'll always have, a Simp Anthem of the Week, which is, it's going to be a good show. And yeah, so I'm pretty geeked about it. Let me hide again.
All right. And you're hidden, and I am adjusted. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think that we finally ended the video. Okay, it was a 4-parter, and I think it was quite extensive and quite illuminating. Running the whole gamut, talking about the degree to which your culture is tied to the wealth outcomes, right? And everything in there about whether or not it is even worth measuring these gaps. What is the impetus? What are the reasons for these gap measurements? What are the reasons for the gap, right? And what is culture? And how can we make some of these changes, which is where we ended. But until next time, okay. And by the way, also, don't forget Case Closed this Sunday, every Sunday, that is, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, Sunday. And
and I think, let's see here. What's going on? What is that? I'm just taking a look. Okay, yeah, that's something else. That's fine. Yeah, so Case Closed. I think it's going to be on my channel again because we did a couple in a row in yours. So I think this one will be also on my channel. And we haven't really talked about the topic yet, but I'm kind of thinking about this masculinity crisis sort of in the Black community.
Well, the new one.
That topic. Yeah. Right. So it'll be an overview of things, but there have been some new developments it's just embarrassing. Just freaking bonnets.
You're talking about bonnets, huh? Okay.
Freaking boys with bonnets on? Men with bonnets? Really? Is that what we're doing? I mean, I don't even know, man.
So yeah, that is interesting. That is an interesting one. I want to go through the dialectic of it, because one will have to ask, what's the intention here, right? Is this some kind of a thing? Because there's obviously a side that doesn't. There is a side of me that doesn't.
It doesn't care about it.
Yeah, because well, or what I mean is, like, if you take it on a higher level, like, wearing a skirt is okay. It just depends on the cultural context, right? In terms of, like, there's a picture of me on my YouTube community tab wearing a skirt.
Right. So I guess, what is it? if you're in Scotland.
Yeah, like that type of level of stuff, of looking at things from that level, like saying, okay, this is an article, it's an artifact, it's a headgear, or who's this, that kind of, if we're being platonic level about it. But I know that that's not what's going on here, but that, I want to go through the dialectic of it and see, well, what exactly is going on here, right? Before I just take it hook, line, and sinker as to be like some kind of outward display of, I want to try to understand, what is it? What exactly is this a display of exactly? Who's encouraging it?
We know who doesn't seem to think it's a problem.
Woo.
So, yeah. Well, we'll leave it there.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, shout out to you guys. Thanks again to all the super chatters, Technological Chaos, and whom else did that? See, now I've got my foot in my mouth. And I don't have.
Probably tell you. I can probably.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Atonement and Nick Tin. Yeah, I was lucky enough to find it. Thank you very much. Until next time, we are out. Hopefully, the microphone and the camera situation will be better. Peace.
In the den of iniquity, vicinity no pretty, calamity fi hit we any moment, what a pity. Tomorrow never certain, what dwells behind the curtain, the face of evil lurking with that shifty eyes averting. It's not a steady bubble, that either pop or topple, many will fall and stumble, let the dozers gather rubble. From LA to Colorado, Guinea to Burkina Faso, cannons could reach the towers and the troops will storm the castle. I say, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. So run, come, make we get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. I say, run, come, make we get it. Because the peace that is bestowed upon the meek is overrated. Lord, run, come, make we get it. Calling all your daughters and your sons, we come forget it. With the rubble steady rising, and hearts are compromising. Convictions here are stifling, making evil appetizing. The fists are steady forming, and countenance is falling. Defenses are withdrawing, possibilities are falling. In these circumstances, evil will make advances. Pick up your sword and lances, and be sure to take your stances. Victory is never promised, the battle is upon us. Gather the brave and honest, and the righteous in your corners.